All right, welcome to our first adult forum of 2022. Not quite what we were expecting, but the good news is we've been here before and this too shall pass. Hopefully sooner rather than later. Hopefully, I think we're all praying that this will be more temporary than the last time we all did this. But thank you for being here. Thank you for coming. And today's topic will be the most recent social statement that the ELCA has adopted called Faith, Sexism, and Justice, a Call to Action. And this particular social statement was adopted at the 2019 ELCA Church-wide Assembly, which some of you may be aware, every 3 or so years, the entire ELCA gathers together in one place to kind of do the business of the church. It's sort of like a big fun reunion of Lutherans, but also like some annual meeting elements. You got to do like budget stuff and talk about, the businessy things, but you also get to talk about fun things that have happened in the last 3 years or that are coming up to be done by the entire ELCA. And ELCA people from all over the country get to come and drink coffee and vote and go to meetings, but there's also lots of time for socializing. So I was actually able to attend the last one, which was in Milwaukee in 2019. And so I got to see this particular social statement be adopted, which basically was sort of like a presentation acknowledging it, and then we voted. So it wasn't like super like contentious or anything like that, but it was pretty exciting. So let's dig in. All right, first of all, what is a social statement? Because we don't usually talk or hear about the fact that the ELCA does social statements. So here we go. This is kind of the best explanation I could find in a nutshell for what is a social statement. And I'm just going to kind of read what this quote is, because I think this really gets at the heart of it, but also I'm going to stop and kind of explain it as we dive in. So what is a social statement? The ELCA social statements are teaching and policy documents that provide broad frameworks to assist us in thinking about and discussing social issues in the context of faith and life. So these are all the bolds are my addition. So it's things that are happening in the world, but we're interpreting it through our lenses of our Lutheran faith. They're meant to help communities, so church groups, and also individuals with moral formation, discernment, and thoughtful engagement with current social issues as we participate in God's work in the world. Social statements also set policy for the ELCA and guide its advocacy and work as a publicly engaged church. They result from an extensive process of participation and deliberation and are adopted by a 2/3 vote of an ELCA church-wide assembly. So this is sort of a twofold thing, a teaching document and also a policy document. So it guides who we are as ELCA Lutherans, but also guides our actions of how we are to be in the world. Communities of faith like congregations can use these as teaching tools, but also these are good just to be aware of as individuals. And these don't fall out of the sky. There is an extensive process, which we'll get into in a second, and 2/3 is the vote that's needed at an ELCA church-wide assembly. So they can only be adopted every 3 years when these happen. So first, what are some of these ELCA social statements? We have many of them, actually. The one we just had adopted in 2019 is not the first one that we've ever done. Unfortunately, this list is in alphabetical order and not in year order, but you can see there's a wide variety and range of topics that the ELCA has decided to put work into creating social statements. Abortion, care for creation, church and society, church and criminal justice, the death penalty, economic life, education, genetics, health and healthcare, human sexuality, peace, race, ethnicity, and culture. And then, of course, the most recent one, sexism. And actually, spoiler alert, there's a new one that's in the works, which we will talk about in a little bit at the very end. All right. As I said, social statements don't fall from the sky. There is a long process that happens for them to get to their inception to a church-wide assembly to be voted on. First of all, a relevant issue needs to be identified. That could happen a couple different ways. It could happen among synods, probably at like a synod assembly like we have in Metro DC. A resolution could be written up and sent along to be forwarded to church-wide as something that we feel like needs to be addressed. And if enough synods kind of are on the same page, that could get the process rolling. It could be an issue that's identified at church-wide council. So yes, like we have a congregational council and a synod council, there's also a church-wide council that delegates from all over the ELCA are elected to at the church-wide assembly. Also, these processes can get started at the church-wide assembly itself. People can nominate or make petitions from the floor and get the ball rolling, but the whole process won't happen at that same assembly, but you can get it started at a synod assembly or at a church-wide assembly, which is kind of exciting. Then after the issue is identified, there is a task force that is assembled that is a mix of pastors and lay people from all different walks of life and from all over the country. And they meet periodically and start a draft of what this statement will look like. Then when they've worked on that, a draft gets circulated for feedback. For this most recent one, in the mail, I got it says draft social statement on women and justice for study and response prior to September 30th, 2018. So when that came to us actually came to me in the mail, the idea was that you would bring this to your community of faith or other people, you would read through it, you would talk about it, and there's lots of forms that you can submit for feedback, corrections, additions, subtractions, so that there's input across the ELCA. So that happens in congregations. It also happens, things like revisions and consultations, amendments happen between other groups in the ELCA. For example, the Council of Bishops, which is all of the 65 synods of the ELCA, have a bishop and like they get together and they talk about this. And once all the revisions and all the feedback is in, and eventually there's a final draft that gets presented at the ELCA church-wide assembly, and that's what gets voted on. Almost always there's like amendments and additions and subtractions on the floor and amendments to amendments, but hopefully if the whole process goes according to plan, it will get adopted by two-thirds vote at a church-wide assembly. So let's dig into this particular social statement, faith, sexism, and justice. So there's a number of sections that this statement is broken up into, and we're going to kind of take it section by section. There, if you go online to check it out, there's a long version and a short version, and we're kind of digging into the short version because I feel like that pretty much gets at the heart of the matter of what this document intends to say. So I pulled, for each section, I've kind of pulled some quotes that encapsulate what each section is trying to get across. So in the first section, we have the statement, being in the image of the triune God means that we humans are relational, that we are interconnected. So in this first section, we're sort of laying the groundwork for the teachings that we espouse as Christians and as Lutherans. So we're sort of laying the foundation of why are we talking about this and what do we as Christians and Lutherans have to say. So first of all, the statement lays out things like we're all created by God for abundant and full life. We acknowledge that sin exists in the world and that God's desire is to free us from the bondage of sin. And so as Christians and as people of faith, we are called to work for the justice of our neighbor as part of the body of Christ. So nothing too out there So fairly basic stuff, but still important to kind of lay the groundwork of like, this is where we're coming from so that we can launch into the other statements and let them kind of pull their own weight. So the second section is the analysis of the problem. Sin subverts human flourishing in many ways. So basically this kind of gets at, why in the world are we talking about this? Why does this particular issue of sexism and gender justice needs to be addressed? So here's two kind of encapsulating quotes. Though God desires fullness of life and equity for everyone, as a church, we recognize that women and girls in particular suffer a range of harm and injustice due to biological sex or gender or both. And also, as Christians, we see that patriarchy and sexism prevent all human beings from living into the abundant life for which God created them. Patriarchy and sexism reflect a lack of trust in God and results in harm and broken relationships. So in this section, we dig into some really important terms alongside of analyzing the problems that have led to gender injustice and sexism. One of the terms that comes up in this section is intersectionality, which is a word that is becoming more, I think, well-known as we have, as a world and as a culture, have been struggling with a lot of these issues that is named in this particular section. And that we know that gender and sexism is also intersecting with a lot of other realities that people are also living often at the same time. So we have, and not just do we have gender or sexuality, but we also have things like race that are coming into play, which is related to racism and discrimination. Things like socioeconomic status, disability and ability, sexuality, LGBTQIA issues, your immigration status, the list goes on. So it's not just a gender thing that is often at play in the injustices that we see in the world, but sometimes it's a kind of a confluence of both gender and race, or gender and race and economic status, gender, race, and immigration status, for example. So it does a great job of acknowledging there's lots of things at work that influence gender injustice. It also does some defining of the patriarchy, and kind of the short version is it's a system that centers on men's actions, voices, and authority, and lays out also that it's both men and women. So everyone is negatively affected by the problem of patriarchy. So it's not just, you know, the men doing things to women. Men are hurt by this system, women are hurt by the system, but also just as men participate in the system, women also participate in the system, non-binary people as well. But it's a system that isn't defined necessarily just by individuals' actions, but it's a system that we are all a part of and we are all harmed by. And this section ties the problem of patriarchy in with the problem of sin and how we deny one another's humanity. So this is kind of like some of the meat of this particular statement. All right, the next statement kind of lays out, well, what does our faith have to say to all of this bad stuff? The quote I pulled is, the Christian theological tradition is full of ideas and teachings that can negatively and positively affect people. So first it lays out how, yes, unfortunately, the church has been historically complicit in sexism and patriarchy. There are plenty of examples in the course of Christian history where women and non-binary people have been silenced and pushed to the side. We as a church aren't perfect in this realm, unfortunately. However, our Lutheran tradition and our Christian tradition also has a lot to say in our interpretation of scripture and our resources and our liturgy and the things that we believe, that also in and of themselves are resources to combat gender injustice, which is kind of what was being laid out in the first section. So here we have this interesting dichotomy where the church has been used plenty of times to be complicit in the injustice of sexism, but also we have within our faith the resources to counter interpret that, to encourage and to lean on our belief that God intends flourishing for all people. So instead of chucking out Christianity, hopefully, we can somehow find ourselves in this both and situation, which is very Lutheran. We rely on the word and a lot in our faith. We are saint and sinner. We have the law and gospel. So we love to occupy this kind of liminal space of the in-between. And I think that's a really powerful witness and resource that we can use in the final two sections, which talks about what can we as a church do moving forward. So, all right, part of the last two sections. So the first of the final two sections is the response of how the ELCA is called to new commitments and actions as a church. So this section talks more about what do we do internally and also kind of in the realm of the church world. So the quote I pulled is, the church recognizes that the body of Christ is called to honor and support women and girls from a variety of backgrounds, identities, and personal experiences in ways more consistent with life-giving theology and practice. So in this section, the ELCA begins to lay out some of its commitments and actions moving forward, both as kind of a body of the church, but also like as individuals as part of it. So within this framework, the ELCA commits to Bible translations and interpretations that acknowledge patriarchal and sexist historical contexts. So that means using a diversity of teaching resources that aren't just centered on only the voices of men or specifically white men, and also acknowledging that, some parts of the Bible were written in periods of time that were not very friendly to certain types of people, and acknowledging that sometimes that gets baked into our biblical texts. The next one is theological reflections that support gender-based needs. The next one is using inclusive language. So that one is, for example, in using language when we talk about God, not just using he language, but using he or she or they or God's self. Sometimes it gets a little awkward, but it kind of breaks open the binary of gendering God and accidentally gendering God in a particular way, which some people hear and pick up and then don't see themselves reflected in the image of God, which is a shame. The next one is promote practices toward equitable leadership in the ELCA. And so this is supporting, for example, female and non-binary leaders and putting those structures, making them formalized into how people get called into seminary. How do they called to be pastors? How do they be called into individual congregations? When patriarchy is baked into our system as a whole, there are unintended ways that women and non-binary people get blocked and delayed getting calls in the church. I want to say anecdotally that the delay is like about 2 years can be for certain people, especially in the LGBTQIA community. And that's not cool when you're sitting around twiddling your thumbs for 2 years after you've graduated seminary. You kind of want to get to work. And so this means, what are some things can we put into place that encourage congregations to explore and expand their ideas of who leaders can be? Related to that is making sure that there is equitable pay and benefits across the board. Statistically, anecdotally, I don't have numbers with me. Women and people of color are statistically paid less than their white male counterparts in the ELCA. And kind of related to the one I just talked about, are more likely to be finding calls in traditional areas that are either lower income, less able to fully support their pastors in their pay packages and benefits, or are part-time, which is a calling in and of itself, but when that's maybe not the first choice of all pastors is to be a part-time pastor, but maybe that's in an inner city church, that's all they can afford at the moment. So how can we as the ELCA kind of right this injustice as it comes out in the equitable pay and benefits for all of its rostered leaders and all of its other leaders as well? And then of course, challenge and engage other Christians in these particular practices that we just named. And one example I will lift up for this particular bullet point is the ELCA is part of a global Lutheran communion called the Lutheran World Federation. And within the Lutheran World Federation, there's like 98 like individual member bodies, like the ELCA is one. 18 or so % of the Lutheran World Federation member churches do not ordain women. And in fact, when I actually was able to attend the 2017 Lutheran World Federation Global Assembly, I was invited to preach, which was really, really cool. But I learned that statistic there. And I also learned that right before that assembly, I think it was Latvia, had women's ordination and then voted to rescind, to take away the ordination of women. And so during that assembly, there were times when that member church was called out for it. So that's what this particular one means, is we challenge, especially eternally, our member body churches to say, we really should work on this gender imbalance together. All right. The final section is our response to this call for action outside of the church, or what do we do as the ELCA members kind of out in the world? And many of the examples listed, I've also kind of connected to real world issues that most of these are happening right now. First of all, support laws and policies that promote rather than discriminate against diverse bodies. As the ELCA, we're really into advocacy. We also want to support the eradication of gender-based violence. And one example of how the ELCA is participating in that is a global movement called Thursdays in Black, which began in the 80s in South America as a kind of a local push toward ending gender-based violence, violence against women, and has now been taken on by the World Council of Churches and a lot of other denominations, especially in the United States, have taken this up. It's basically, it started as a movement of just women wearing black, and it's kind of become a global phenomenon, and it is a hashtag, and it's a way to be a visible reminder and a way to stand in solidarity of women and girls around the world who are still suffering from gender-based violence. So it's pretty simple. Every Thursday, wear black. And if you feel so moved or have a social media account, take a picture of yourself wearing black and use the hashtag Thursdays in Black. And the more people do this, the more it's visible. And I think it's kind of cool. The next one is support healthcare. So that just a couple of examples of that include reproductive health care, abortion care, IVF care, that type of thing. The next one is advocate for just economic policies and regulations. So this kind of one big example of this in our world is the economic pay gap. And there's lots of information about how both women and people of color are suffered negatively from the very real reality that they're paid less or tend to be in jobs that are less valued and therefore are paid less. We seek to promote nuanced understanding of social and economic roles of men and women and non-binary people. And I put anti-complementarianism as the example of that. And what I mean is there are sections, this is a little bit more of a church thing, but there are denominations that subscribe to something called complementarianism, which means that men have their roles here over here and women have their roles over here. And so men should have certain types of jobs and women should have these other types of jobs, and never the twain shall meet. Never can you mix the two. And so we as the ELCA would see that as, no, if you're called to a vocation, you should be able to do that vocation, even if it's, whether it's a traditionally male role, traditionally female role, doesn't matter. The next one is support families of all configurations. So this means supporting adoption and things like affordable childcare. The next one is legal reforms for services for vulnerable populations such as immigrants and migrants. That one's kind of self-explanatory. Next is support portrayals of women and girls in media that are not stereotypes or objectifying. I think we can all think of examples in advertisements or in movies when we're like, why is that woman in a bikini? She is advertising a hamburger. What does that have to do with anything? And I encourage you to check out a group that's doing great work on this called Ms. Representation. Google it. It's got a website. It's got videos. It's a great resource and I love it. The last one is increase women's opportunities in local, state, and national government and policy creation. Pretty self-explanatory. The more representation women and others can have in creating these laws, the more that these people can be advocated for. All right, here's just a couple of resources that just, it's like, this is like the tip of the iceberg if you want to know more. And I've just kind of put some of my favorite resources up here. Dr. Caroline Lewis, who is a Lutheran professor at Luther Seminary, has written a great book called She, the 5 Keys to Unlock the Power of Women in Ministry. That's a really good book. Most recently, Dr. Beth Allison Barr wrote a great book called The Making of Biblical Womanhood, which really pulls apart some of this, how the church has been tied up in patriarchy. Nadia Boltweber, one of our own Lutheran speakers, also wrote a book about gender and sexuality called Shameless, which is also really good. Here's the website for the ELCA participation in the Thursdays in Black movement. And then most recently, I read a book by Kendall Rothaus called Thy Queendom Come, which talks a lot about inclusive language for God. And I used that, a couple of examples from them in a couple of my most recent sermons. All right, we're going to skip the discussion questions. And then I think this is lastly, reveal. We have a new social statement that's in the works. It's on the horizon. It's called Government and Civic Engagement, working title. So we're developing a social statement on government, civic engagement, the relationship of the church and state and other related matters. This particular statement was called for at the 2019 Churchwide Assembly. So I was there when this issue was raised to the forefront. And we decided as that voting body, yeah, this is something that we should pursue more. So this is currently in the draft stage. We do have a social message, which is like a social statement light of a similar name. And that one is part of the working basis for this document. And so this will go through all of the processes and it's scheduled to be adopted in 2025 or so. So these take a little while and we don't usually adopt these lightly. And you can see more information. You go to the elca.org website. There's a search bar and you can search social statements, or you can search government and civic engagement, and more information on this should come up. Also, if you get the Living Lutheran in one of their, I think this was the most recent, I wanted to say episode, the most recent issue of the Living Lutheran has an article that details what is this statement, what is it about, what is going to be said, how does the process work. So go check it out there. So thank you for listening to and learning more about this as a social statement, and hopefully you learned something. All right, I'm gonna stop recording now. All right, stop.